While Samuel was alive, he also served God as judge over the people. He listened to their problems and helped them follow God's laws. Samuel acted as judge for many years. When he grew old, he taught his 2 sons and made them judges. But they were not at all like Samuel. The only thing that interested them was making money. Instead of deciding cases honestly, if they were paid enough money, they would do whatever the person who paid them wanted. The people didn't trust Samuel's sons. They saw them looking after the rich only. So the people went to Samuel and said, "All the other countries have kings ruling over them. We cannot trust your sons to speak the truth. We want a king." "No, you should keep God alone as your king," Samuel said. But the people wouldn't listen. "We want a king! We want a king!" they chanted. Samuel prayed to God. "What do you want, Lord?" God said, "These stubborn people should have known that I was their king. Because they think they cannot follow my laws without the help of a king, go ahead and do what they want. But explain to them how their kings will treat them." So Samuel did as the Lord told him, and passed on the message to the people. "Remember," he warned them, "this king will take away some of your land and some of your flocks. He will want your daughters and your sons to become his servants. The women will have to clean and cook for him, and your sons will fight in his army. You will not like it once you have a king. But however much you cry out to God, he won't help you then, because this was something you asked for." Still the people didn't listen. "We want a king! We want a king!" they shouted. "All right," Samuel said. "You will get your king. Now, go back home." When Samuel had sent the people away, he went home himself and waited for God to tell him who should be king of Israel. At this time, there was a very handsome man from the smallest tribe of Israel, whose name was Saul. His father had lost some donkeys and sent his son to go out looking for them. Saul and his servant searched high and low for the donkeys, but couldn't find them. They'd been gone many days, when Saul said, "Oh, we'd better forget about the donkeys and head back home. If we don't, Father will start worrying more about us than about the animals." "Wait," his servant said. "I've heard about a man of God who says what God tells him to. He's very wise and lives quite close to here. Maybe we should ask him if he knows where the donkeys are." Saul thought that was a good idea. So the two started off for Samuel's house. God had told Samuel the day before, "A stranger will visit you tomorrow. He is the one who will become king over my people." Samuel spent all that day watching for the stranger. He was in town because he was going to be offering a sacrifice at the altar on top of the hill. The people offering the sacrifice were there and were waiting for Samuel to bless it. Just as Samuel started out in that direction, he saw Saul approaching. He couldn't miss him, because Saul was much taller than the other Israelites, and he was one of the best-looking men around. When Saul saw Samuel standing in the gateway, he asked, "Do you know where the holy man of God is?" "That's me," Samuel said. "The Lord has already told me about you. Come and eat with me today. It's you that the people of Israel want so much." In the morning you can leave, after I have told you what the Lord has shown me. Don't worry about the missing donkeys. They've been found." Saul shook his head, trying to understand the strange things Samuel was telling him. "I'm from the least important family, in the least important tribe in Israel," he said. "Why say such things to me?" "Come with me to the offering," Samuel said. "You may eat at the head of the table and have the best cuts of meat. Stay with me and let me honor you." Saul didn't understand what was happening, but did as the man of God told him. After the meal following the offering, Saul spent the night at Samuel's house. The next morning, Samuel told Saul it was time for him to go home. As the two men walked towards the edge of town, Samuel said, "Send your servant on ahead, so I can give you a message from God." When the servant had left them, Samuel turned to Saul and poured olive oil over his head to show that he was special. "The Lord has chosen you to lead his people and rule over them as king," Samuel said. Saul bowed his head. How can this be? He wondered. All that had happened seemed so strange and impossible. How could Samuel know all this? Saul learned later that God had told Samuel all these things, including what would happen to him that day. "Saul, when you leave here today, you'll meet two men who will say, 'The donkeys which you have been looking for have been found. Now, return to your father before he starts to worry.'" Saul nodded. "On your way back, you'll meet some other people," Samuel continued. "These men will be prophets, playing music and worshipping the Lord. The Spirit of the Lord will come upon you and change your heart. You will join them and do whatever God leads you to do. Afterwards, go ahead of me to Gilgal, where I will meet you, and we will offer sacrifices to the Lord." Then Samuel sent Saul on his way, and it all happened just as Samuel had said it would. When Saul saw all the things Samuel had told him about actually happening, he knew it was because God was making them happen. Saul came down the hill and met a group of prophets. They were singing and worshipping God, playing musical instruments. Then the Spirit of the Lord filled Saul in the same way as the prophets, and Saul joined in with their worship, becoming like them. The people who were listening were amazed. "What has happened to Saul?" they asked. "Has he become a prophet too?" Saul's uncle saw them, and Saul told him that they had met Samuel and had been told where the donkeys could be found. But Saul didn't say anything about becoming king. Soon after this, Samuel called the people together. "You say you want a king?" he asked. The people shouted, "Yes, we want a king." "All right, God will choose a king for you," Samuel said. First of all, Samuel asked all the tribes to come forward, and God chose the tribe of Benjamin. Then Saul's family was picked out. Samuel went through each man in that family until God chose Saul. "Where is this man?" the people said. "Who is Saul?" The people all looked around. "Where is he?" Samuel asked the Lord, and he told them that Saul was hiding among the bags and baskets. The people ran and found Saul, then brought him to Samuel. "See how tall he is," they said. "This is your king." said Samuel. The people cheered. "Long live the king!" Samuel told the people about the rules they would have to follow when they had a king. He wrote them down on a scroll and put them in a holy place. Then Samuel told the people to go home. All the brave men of Israel promised to follow Saul and went back with him to his home. But there were some who didn't agree with God's choice. They were troublemakers and didn't like Saul. When they left that day, they grumbled about what had happened and didn't take Saul any gifts. Soon after this, the fierce Ammonites attacked an Israelite town called Jabesh. The Ammonites surrounded the town and invaded it. The people in the town were very afraid and asked the king of Ammon to make a treaty with them, so he would become their king. But the Ammonite king said, "Ha! Why should we make peace when we can destroy you? I will only make peace after I've cut out the right eyes of all your men. That'll be a sign to everyone of just how weak Israel is. Then you can have your peace treaty." The people of Jabesh were shocked. That was a terrible price to pay for peace. So they sent back another messenger who said, "Give us 7 days to find others who will come and fight with us." Messengers ran far and wide, asking other Israelites to help rescue the people of Jabesh. But the Israelites felt so helpless and afraid, they only began to cry. Saul was coming in from the fields when he heard all the crying. He asked what had happened, and when the people told him, the Spirit of God came on Saul, and he was furious. He took his oxen and cut them into pieces. Then he sent the chunks of meat to every part of Israel, with messengers who said, "This is what will happen to the oxen of anyone who does not follow Saul and Samuel into battle against the Ammonites." Then the people became very afraid, and hundreds of thousands of men reported for duty. That night, Saul prepared his army, and at dawn he led his men into battle against the Ammonites. They fought until noon, and won the battle. It was a great victory. Some people said, "We should kill those men who don't want Saul to be a king over us. Now there's no doubt that he's a good choice." But Saul said, "No, there will be no more killing. Today, the Lord has saved Israel." Samuel led the people to Gilgal, and there Saul was officially made king. The people offered sacrifices to the Lord and had a great party, celebrating God's choice of Saul as their king. God blessed Saul in the early years of his reign. Later, however, Saul turned away from God and went his own way. He became proud and forgot about God. The Lord then told Saul, through Samuel, that he no longer wanted him as king. Samuel was so sad that Saul had failed to obey God since he became king that he cried. But the Lord said to him, "How much longer will you be upset? I want you to take olive oil to Bethlehem and ask to see the sons of Jesse. There I will show you the next king." So Samuel did what the Lord said. When he arrived, the leaders of Bethlehem were very frightened. If Saul were to find out, he might try and kill Samuel and the people living in Bethlehem. Not only that, everyone in the land knew Samuel was a prophet for God. "Has he come to punish us?" they wondered. So they asked Samuel, "Do you come in peace?" "In peace," Samuel said. Then he invited them to come with him and worship the Lord. "Send for Jesse and his sons too," he said. When everyone was there, Samuel took one look at Eliab, Jesse's eldest son, and thought, "Ah, this must be the next king." Look how tall and handsome he is." But the Lord said, "I am God, and I do not measure people by their looks. I look at a person's heart and see what you do not see." One by one the sons came to Samuel, until 7 young men had passed by him. Samuel turned to Jesse. "The Lord has not chosen any of these," he said. "Are these all the sons you have?" "Well," Jesse said, "there is one more, but he's the youngest and he's out looking after the sheep." So Jesse's youngest son, David, was sent for. The boy had sparkling brown eyes, and his skin was tanned from afternoons spent on the hillside, watching his sheep. He was handsome and strong. The Lord said, "This is the one." Then Samuel took the olive oil and poured it over David's head. This meant David had been chosen to be the next king. Everyone who was watching gasped. They knew olive oil meant, "How can David become king?" They wondered. From that day on, the Spirit of the Lord took control of David and stayed with him. Samuel gave no answers to the questions everyone was whispering around him. He stood up and went back home. God had chosen his next king, but it was not yet time to tell all the people about it. David went back to looking after his sheep in the pastures. He was on the hillsides for hours each day, watching over the sheep and making sure no lions or wolves harmed them. If any animal did threaten them, David would get out his sling, load it with a stone, aim, and let it go. Then the stone whistled through the air and killed the animal. After Samuel had poured the oil on David, David grew closer to God, while Saul grew away from him. God's spirit was not with Saul anymore, and an evil spirit sent by the Lord tormented him. Saul's servants said he should find someone who could calm him with soothing music. "Where can we find a man like that?" Saul asked. "I've seen a son of Jesse who's a good musician," a servant said. "He's also brave, handsome, and a good soldier and speaker. Not only that, but the Lord is with him." So Saul sent for David, and Jesse sent his son to Saul with a donkey loaded with gifts of bread and wine for the king. When David arrived, he played his harp for the king, and his music brought some peace of mind to Saul. From then on, whenever Saul was depressed and felt darkness all around him, David's harp and his singing helped to bring the light back. David spent the next few years going back and forth between King Saul and his father's house. Whenever David returned to his father's house, he continued to look after the sheep. Among Saul's soldiers were 3 of David's elder brothers. Because Jesse had sons in the army, he often sent supplies to the men wherever they were fighting. Sometimes he asked David to take them. In that way, David could bring news of the battle back to Jesse and let him know how his 3 other sons were doing. During one battle, Saul and his soldiers were camped on one side of a valley, opposite the Philistine army on the other side of the valley. Both armies were waiting to fight. A Philistine soldier named Goliath, who was a very tall man, a giant, had challenged the Israelites. "If any of you want to fight me," he said, "then I dare you to try. If I win, then you will all become our slaves. If your man wins, then we will have to serve you." All Saul's men took one look at Goliath and shivered in fear. "How can we fight a giant like that?" they whispered. No one dared to volunteer for the job. Even David's brothers were too afraid to fight Goliath. This went on for a long time. At this time, David was staying at home, and his father asked if he would take supplies to his brothers. David was glad to go. It meant spending time in the army camp, hearing the latest news. David left his flock with another shepherd and made his way to the valley where Saul and his men were. Just as he reached the valley, he saw all the soldiers lining up, the Philistines against the Israelites. He ran as fast as he could between the soldiers, looking everywhere for his brothers. He wanted to reach them before the battle began. When he found them, he had just asked, "What's happening?" When suddenly a great cry went up from the Israelite soldiers. "Here he comes again! Run for your life, it's the giant! Look at him!" they said to each other. "Listen to his challenge! King Saul promised to give a big reward to the man who kills him. The king will let him marry his daughter and not pay any taxes." When David heard Goliath's insults, he was very angry. "Who is this Philistine who dares to defy the army of the living God?" he said. News reached Saul that there was a young man asking about fighting Goliath, so he sent for David. David said, "I will go and fight Goliath, so that we won't look like cowards anymore. There's no reason why soldiers of Israel should be afraid." Saul said, "You cannot fight him. You are a boy, and he has been a soldier all his life. I've often rescued sheep from the mouths of lions or bears," David replied. "I've killed those animals barehanded, and I'll do the same to this Philistine who's defied the army of the Lord's chosen people. The Lord has saved me from wild animals, and he will save me from Goliath." When Saul saw that he couldn't talk David out of it, he said, "May God go with you." Then Saul got David to try on his armor and weapons, but they didn't fit him. David threw it off and said he would meet the Philistine dressed as the shepherd that he was. When the time came for David to meet Goliath, David chose 5 smooth stones from a nearby brook. Then, with his catapult ready, he went out to fight the giant. When Goliath saw him, he roared, "What an insult! You dare to offend me by sending a boy to fight the great Goliath? Have you come to fight me with sticks, as if I were a dog? Come here, and I'll make your body into food for the birds and animals." But David told him, "You come against me with sword and spear, but I come against you in the name of the God of our army. Today, God will help me strike you down, and I will cut off your head. Then the whole world will know it's not a sword which wins battles, but the power of the Lord." Goliath had heard enough. He moved closer to attack David. Both armies lined the valley. The Israelites held their breath, but the Philistines were laughing. Suddenly David darted towards Goliath. He stopped, fitted his catapult with a stone, swung it around his head, then let it fly. It whirled through the air, faster than Goliath could raise his spear to throw it at David, and made a hole right in Goliath's head. The giant fell with a mighty thud on the ground. David took Goliath's big heavy sword and cut his head off. At first, the Philistines were shocked, and then they were afraid. They all turned and ran, and the men of Israel chased after them. A great battle was won that day, thanks to the shepherd boy from Bethlehem and his faith in the Lord. Saul was so pleased with David that he brought him back to his palace and didn't want him to go home anymore. He made David an officer in his army and ordered him to help keep the peace throughout Israel. Every time David returned from winning more fights or killing more Philistines, he became more of a hero with the people. Once when David came back from killing Philistines, a group of women from all over Israel gathered to meet King Saul, David, and the other soldiers. They sang, "Saul has killed his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." This made Saul very angry and jealous. He thought to himself, "David's already more popular than I am. At this rate, the people will soon make him king." So from that day on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. One day, as David was playing the harp for Saul, Saul became uncontrollable. He had a spear in his hand and thought, "I'll pin David to the wall." He threw the spear twice, but David managed to dodge it. Then Saul tried to get David killed by sending him out as commander of a war against the Philistines. But this only helped to make David more of a hero. Once, while David was away fighting the Philistines, Saul's daughter, Michal, prayed he might return alive. She loved David very much, and Saul had said that if David won the battle, she could marry him. Because God was with David, he did everything well, and this time was no different. When he returned with the proof of his killing, Saul let Michal marry him, but grew even more afraid of David than before. David had the Lord with him, and Saul did not. The people loved David and cheered whenever he passed through the city. Now David had the love of Saul's daughter to make him even stronger. Saul decided he would always be David's enemy. In the time before Saul and David were enemies, David had become a very close friend of Jonathan, Saul's son. David had met Jonathan just after he had killed Goliath, when Saul brought him back to his palace to make him one of his officers. One day David had been talking with Saul, and when they'd finished, David heard someone behind him. He turned and saw Jonathan, who'd just come in. The two young men looked at each other. In that second, something happened between Jonathan and David, and they both knew that they would be friends for life. When Jonathan and David left Saul that day, they left together. The two young men grew even closer as time went on, and they loved each other dearly. Jonathan gave his robe, sword, bow, and belt to David. Now that Saul was so angry with David, it made things difficult for Jonathan. Saul told Jonathan and his servants that he planned to kill David. But Jonathan was more than a brother to David. He ran to him and said, "My father wants to kill you. Please, be very careful. You must hide. Then I will talk to my father about you in the morning, and if I find out anything, I'll let you know." The next morning, Jonathan was true to his word. He spent most of the morning walking with his father through the fields. He talked about how good David was, and how wrong Saul was to try to have him killed. Eventually, Saul promised not to hurt David, and David came back to the palace. But Saul did not keep his promise. Saul could not be trusted. Some days he was pleasant to David, and at other times he tried to kill him. More and more often he blew up in anger for no reason at all. One evening, David was playing his harp for Saul, when suddenly Saul sprang out of his chair and grabbed his spear. He flung it with all his might at David, but David ducked just in time, and the spear clattered to the ground. David ran from the room as fast as he could and escaped into the darkness. When David arrived home, out of breath, he told his wife Michal what had happened. Michal loved David very much. Even though she was Saul's daughter, she knew Saul was wrong to try to hurt David. "Hurry," she said. "He will send guards to get you. You must escape tonight." David climbed out of the window at the back of the house. Michal lowered him down with a rope and watched as he ran off into the darkness. David had only just gone when Saul's soldiers burst into the house. Michal ran and put a statue in David's bed, covered it with clothes, and put some goat's hair at its head. The soldiers threw the door open, just as she finished covering the statue with a blanket. "Where's David?" they demanded. "He's sick. Can't you see he's in bed?" she said. The soldiers looked at the shape in the bed and said to each other, "David's not going anywhere tonight." Then they returned to Saul. But Saul said, "Go back and bring him here." When the soldiers returned to Michal and David's house, they pushed her aside and threw back the covers on the bed. When they saw they'd been tricked, they took hold of Michal and brought her back to Saul. "Why did you lie to my soldiers, giving David a chance to get away?" he asked. "He said he would kill me if I didn't help him to escape," she answered. But that was not what had really happened. She had wanted to help David get away. Even as Saul asked his daughter questions, David was making his way to Samuel's home. He told him everything that had happened. Saul chased David, but David circled back and found Jonathan. "What have I done? Why does your father want to kill me?" he cried out. Jonathan could hardly believe the story David told him. Together they thought up a plan, so they could know for certain whether or not Saul really wanted to kill David. There was a chance that his mood might change again. Jonathan would pretend that David had gone home to Bethlehem. If Saul was angry, they would know that David was still in great danger. David and Jonathan agreed on a signal. David would hide in a field, and after Jonathan talked with Saul about David, Jonathan would go into the field and practice shooting arrows. If Saul really did want to hunt down David and kill him, Jonathan would tell the boy who found the arrows and brought them back, "Look, the arrows are on the other side of you." Jonathan walked with David out to the field where he would hide and wait for Jonathan's signal. The two young men felt very close. Jonathan said to David, "May God be our witness. If my father wants to hurt you, and I don't warn you, let the Lord punish me. If I die, let my children and yours be best of friends forever. May our promise of friendship last forever." Then the two separated. David hid in the field, and Jonathan went back to wait for his father. 2 days later, Saul asked Jonathan why David hadn't been eating with them as usual. When Jonathan told him it was because David had wanted to visit his family in Bethlehem, Saul leapt up and grabbed his spear again. "What? You're no son of mine. Now I know that you're taking sides with David against me. You told him he could go? You let him get away? You fool. There's no way you will ever become king while he is alive. Now send for him, for he must die." "Why does David have to die? What has he done?" Jonathan cried out. At that, Saul threw his spear at Jonathan, but missed. Jonathan got up from the table, shaking with anger, and refused to eat with his father. He was torn in two with grief about David, because of what his father had said. The next morning, Jonathan ran to the field with his bow and arrow. He shot an arrow and used the signal they had agreed to let David know that he wasn't safe. Then he sent the boy who was collecting his arrows home, and David came out of hiding. The two friends were so sad that they cried as they hugged each other. Both young men knew it would be a long time before they could see each other again. David would no longer be able to live in peace. He would have to hide from Saul, running from place to place, never daring to rest. Jonathan went back to the city, and David began his escape from jealous King Saul. Everywhere David went, Men who didn't trust Saul, or who were in trouble, came to him to fight by his side. His brothers, father, friends, and even strangers all joined David. The men moved from cave to cave, hillside to hillside, through the desert and between the cliffs. They were always on the run from Saul's soldiers. But whatever happened, David prayed to God to find out when they should leave a place and where they should go next. David knew God protected him, and he trusted the Lord. One day, a messenger came to David. "The Philistines are attacking the Hebrew town of Keilah." David prayed, asking God if he and his men should go and fight the Philistines. The Lord answered him, "Go and attack the Philistines, and save the people of Keilah." But David's men were afraid, so David asked the Lord to guide him a second time. Again the Lord said, "Go down to Keilah. I will hand the Philistines over to you." David and his men did as the Lord said. They rescued the town of Keilah and won a great battle against the enemy Philistines. Afterwards, Saul heard that David was in Keilah, and he thought, now I have David. Keilah is a walled city with many gates and barred windows, just like a jail. I can trap him inside, and there's no way he can escape from me." When David heard Saul was coming after him with a huge force of men, he asked God, "Will Saul come? And if he does, will the people hand us over to him?" "Yes," God told him. So David and his men fled into the desert. They traveled at night under the cover of darkness, and when it was coolest. Day after day Saul searched for him, but God helped David to hide in all the right places. After days and nights of running from one place to another, David finally stopped and told his men they could rest for a few days. They had camped on a hillside where there were many caves. David posted lookouts on all sides. The men had only just started setting up camp when suddenly a cry went up from the guard. "Someone is coming!" The men fell silent. Everyone waited. If it was one of Saul's scouts, then Saul was too close and they would have to start running again. Was the visitor a friend or an enemy? As the stranger came closer, they could see he was alone. David's guards waited a few minutes, then they seized the man. He didn't struggle against them. "I'm a friend," he called out. "Take me to David. He knows who I am." The guards brought him into the camp, and David came out to see who the stranger was. When he saw him, he cried out loud, "Jonathan! My brother Jonathan!" The two friends fell into each other's arms. They hadn't seen each other since the first night David started running from Saul. David hugged Jonathan and cried with joy. "My friend," he gasped. "Is there no rest from all this running? Even the towns we saved from the Philistines are ready to hand us over to your father. My men don't complain, but there's hardly anything to eat, and we hardly ever have a chance to sleep. I don't know. Sometimes I wonder how we can possibly go on." Jonathan took hold of his friend's shoulders. David looked dirty and tired, hungry and alone. Jonathan steered his friend into a nearby cave where they could talk. As they walked by some of the other men, Jonathan noticed how tired they all looked. Once in the cave, they sat down, and Jonathan looked David straight in the eyes. "Don't be afraid," he said. "My father won't lay a hand on you. One day you will be king over Israel, and I will be second to you. Even Saul knows this." Jonathan stayed with David and helped him to feel better. But that was the last time David and Jonathan would ever see each other. When Jonathan left him, David felt sure in his heart that God was still in control and would protect him. David would not give up now. Over and over again, Saul found out where David was hiding. But when he did, God protected David. Once, Saul was at Gibeah, when people told him that David had camped in the wilderness at Horesh. Saul tried to catch up with David and his men, who were forced to camp on the side of the mountain. They knew Saul was very close. Saul and his soldiers were on the other side of the same mountain, closing in on David. Soon David and his men would be captured. Saul started to round the corner on the cliff, which would have brought David and his men within sight, when suddenly he was given an important message. The Philistines were attacking Saul's country again. David and his men knew Saul was very close behind them. They clung to the cliffs, and David prayed to God for protection. They waited and watched for Saul, expecting him to come into view any minute. Saul was so close they could hear the trumpet blasts from his soldiers. "Listen," David told his men. "Did you hear that?" The men held their breath. Yes, it was the trumpet blast from Saul's troops. "It means they're attacking," one man said. "No, it means Saul is calling off the hunt and retreating. I don't know why," David said. "But Saul is turning around and going home." Saul had indeed turned around. He needed to go back and fight the Philistines who were attacking the Israelite villages. He had almost caught David, but not quite. So David escaped again, thanks to the Lord's protection. Soon after this, the great prophet Samuel died. Samuel had grown very old during the years David was on the run. He had never stopped praying for his people. When Samuel died, all the Israelites felt sad, and huge crowds of people gathered to remember him. Samuel was the last of Israel's judges. While he lived, he had tried to keep peace between the people, reminding them that they should stop worshipping the foreign gods of the tribes around them. Some listened to Samuel, but most did not. Samuel's most important task had been to appoint a king over God's people. When King Saul had stopped obeying God, Samuel was so upset he had cried. Then after he anointed David as king, he prayed that God would protect David all the time Saul was chasing him. Samuel did not live long enough, however, to see the day when David became king. All the people at Samuel's funeral thanked God for what Samuel had done and mourned for him. The Philistines were threatening to invade the whole of Israel. This time they'd gathered all their forces in one place for a mass attack. This was not like the other small battles. This would be a fight to the death. Saul had brought his troops to the battleground and knew it wouldn't be easy to beat the Philistines. He had prayed and prayed, trying to find out what to do to win the coming battle. But God did not answer Saul's prayers. Meanwhile, David was at his home at Ziklag, which was in Philistine territory. While he was there, news came to him of the great battle against Saul and the Israelites. "It was a terrible battle," the messenger told David. "The Philistines chased Saul and his 3 sons and killed them all, including Jonathan." "How do you know that Saul and Jonathan are dead?" David asked him. The messenger continued. "The king was surrounded and hit by many arrows. Then he begged his armor-bearer to kill him, so that the Philistines would not capture and torture him. The armor-bearer refused, so Saul fell on his own sword, killing himself." At this, David tore his clothes in sorrow, and all his men did the same. They grieved and wept, and didn't eat for the whole day. The king anointed by God was dead. Jonathan, David's dear and closest friend, was dead. They grieved for the army of the Lord and for all Israel. Many Israelite villages had fallen into Philistine hands because the Israelites had lost the great battle. It was a dark day for Israel. David wrote a sad song about the loss of that battle and the deaths of Jonathan and Saul. Israel's glory lies dead on the hills, he wrote. How the mighty have fallen, Saul and Jonathan. We were so close, and our love was so great. The brave soldiers have been killed in battle. One of David's most beautiful poems describes death as a dark valley. David wrote about how God is there to take our hand and guide us through the darkness into light. David's words, which came from his experience of life and death, continue to comfort people who miss someone they love or must face death, even today.